Okay, so my obligatory first slide is always this distinction between positive and negative apologetics. So remember, positive apologetics is all about giving reasons for believing in Christianity, and negative apologetics, which is what we're going to be spending the whole of tonight on, is about explaining why certain reasons for rejecting Christianity aren't particularly good.
Polemic.
Say again?
Is it a polemic?
Neither of them are polemics, I guess, but I guess you could say negative apologetics is a response to polemics. Yeah. A polemic could be used in both contexts, right? To say that, if someone says, for instance, you want to give a polemic against other religions or other worldviews, that would be a case of positive apologetics. Whereas if someone is maybe giving an argument that Christianity isn't so great, then you could use polemics as a response to that. So I have this list that I have here on the screen is the list that I've given you of all the objections which I've kind of categorized under different headings. I have slides, although not necessarily thorough slides, on all of the ones that I've highlighted here, which is most of them. As my wife can attest, I was filling out a lot of them in Fury now on the drive here. So there you go. But so hopefully we'll be able to do that. But maybe take a look at it, and you'd pick one. Pick one, and then we'll go talk about it for a bit, and then we'll finish it, and then we'll talk about the next one, and the next one, and the next one, until our time is up. Sound good? This is entirely driven by you guys, so if there's just silence for the next hour, so be it. Yes?
Sorry, so have we already done the theoretical and existential suffering part?
Yes. So you'll notice that in the ones that I've highlighted, the top left one from experience, most of them are not highlighted because we already covered them last week in our suffering talk. So I will ask you to skip those. So the only one from that top section is really human apathy, would be or apatheism, if you've heard of that before, would be the only one left ready to discuss in any significance.
So apathy doesn't feel like an argument.
Say again?
Apathy doesn't sound like an argument.
We're not really talking necessarily, so yeah, not all these objections are necessarily like thought out objections to Christianity. They're objection in a looser sense of reasons why people might not be Christians.
Okay.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you guys keen to do slavery in the Old Testament?
Slavery in the Old Testament. All right, let's go there. I'm going to have to skip to where that is. I'll get there. There we go. Say again?
Was it from morality?
That's under the morality section, slavery in the Old Testament, or in the Ot. Okay, so a common question that gets asked these days, I think, especially we're being we've got a lot of themes about like anti-colonialism and decolonializing things and thinking about the legacy that colonialism has had. I think people are a lot more sensitive these days than maybe they were 50 years ago to this idea of slavery in the Bible. And especially they fear that, hey Lilia, you can just grab a piece of paper there, yeah. They have a fear that the Bible condones slavery, and they think, well, how could I believe in a religion that condones slavery when it's such a cause of evil in the world? So, what do we think? If someone said to you, I don't want to be a Christian because I don't like that the Bible condones slavery, what would you say to them?
Maybe that our definition of slavery differs from what it was in the Bible.
Okay, so how might they be different? So yeah, so that's a common strategy. We maybe distinguish between like servants in the Bible and modern slavery as we have it today. We maybe quibble on the translation of the word slave in the Old Testament. It's like, okay, it's better to call it like a bondservant or something like that. So often a distinction here is made between, I forget the exact word, but chattel slavery, which is the idea that you own someone, rather I should say, as an object in some sense. And what is the other one that people often talk about? Like, I think you could just call it debt or bond slavery, where it's a way of paying things off when you don't have like an established currency in your economy, which is certainly true in the ancient world. How would that help you with talking about it?
I can't remember where, but there's also a scripture that says if you ignore every person that talks badly about you except what your slave says about you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's emphasizing that if your slave talks bad about you, then you should actually listen.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, that makes me think that for that to be true, how they treated their slaves were very important.
Okay.
Treated well.
So they're emphasizing a notion of the Old Testament, let's say, regulations of slavery that uphold them in a higher regard than what we would typically relate with the notion of slavery, which sort of treats them as if they're nothing and disposable, things like that.
Yeah. So
Okay.
to have them to live, I think there's also other scripture that shows that slaves in that time were a part of your household.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, obviously they were cared for as one of your own,
Mm-hmm.
but still not your own. So there is a distinction. But yeah, they were looked after.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
instead of-
slaves are part of the household rather than what we are familiar with today with the transatlantic slave trade, where you have like plantations, where you have almost like concentration camps of slaves where they get hauled together. Yep. That kind of slavery on that scale is not really what is occurring in the ancient world or for most of human history, really. So pretty modern, pretty modern phenomenon. Yep.
I think also during that time, like there was also like obedience with like how you had servants also that time. So again, now focusing on like they were part of your family, you took care of them as like they were your own brother and sister. So that kind of like relates to how like we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. So you make sure you're taking care of them, they do their duties, or you also look after them, and then it gives them now also like their free will. Like if your servant wants to like move on and they want to like start their own family, then you can almost like sign them up so they have that opportunity to maybe move on, but then there's like maybe a conformity to like for them to maybe move on with their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now the slavery that has become like quite a crazy, like how to think about it, like someone like owns a slave and that person is now their slave for life, so then they don't
Right.
have the opportunity to like move on, and then
Mm-hmm.
from the way I've seen like how the Old Testament works out to it.
I think important thing would be, like establishing terms of what they mean. But oftentimes when people raise an objection, they're usually raising, straw man objection,
Okay.
which is like
Well, maybe define what a straw man is for us.
it's
Yep.
a caricature that doesn't. It's the weakest. It's the kind of weakest version of the argument.
Okay.
So they're like, I don't believe in God, or I don't believe in God because the Old Testament condones slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, well, what do you mean? You actually ask questions about what they mean, and that usually is the full extent of their entire knowledge. Is
That statement that they
Yeah,
started.
that's-
Yeah, right.
That's it. And you're like, so what verses? And they like don't know. And so I think actually asking people to go have an honest, why don't you go read some verses and read them and understand them in historical context. And you can acknowledge there are some challenging verses that we probably address, but as a whole, I don't think the Bible actually speaks to what you're thinking about,
Mm-hmm.
and you actually haven't read it.
Mm-hmm.
So, because most people haven't. I mean, most people
Yeah.
don't generally pick up Leviticus and the last 8 chapters of Exodus and read about household code and law and just I just love, especially non-believers. I love reading this.
Yeah.
So I think actually appropriately challenging people about what they're actually saying.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. To force them to be a bit clearer on where they are and help them see that maybe they're not raising this objection from a place of being informed, but mostly about the connotations that they have with certain words
Yeah.
and those associations. It's a very good point. Yeah.
So for me, from what I know of, I'm not well versed on it. But
Well, don't worry. I have a bunch of passages we're going to look at.
slavery
Yeah.
in the Testament, the hardest part actually would be more crossing over into the capital punishment aspect.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's a separate section on that.
Yeah. So I'm saying it's like the trajectory of slavery in the Old Testament has more to do with creating alleviating poverty basically,
Mm-hmm.
and indentured servanthood to create opportunity for people economically.
Indentured servitude. Thank you. That's what I was looking for earlier.
So that's more the trajectory of it.
Yep.
But then the challenging verses are but there are verses, I can't remember something when your slave disobeys, there's capital punishment involved. It's
Sure.
Wait
Wait a second. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's more of the slavery institution of slavery itself in the Old Testament is less of a challenge for me than some things in the periphery around it,
Sure.
which were just more cultural periphery things.
Yeah. All right. Oh, yeah.
I'm just thinking about it now. slavery that took place, but then again it was now more of like you had a servant within your household. I think during that time also like the servants like also had security.
Mm-hmm.
There was also security, it's like for them to now, especially when they want to raise a family, then it's a safe place for them to go and work for their master, and they can earn little income that they can, but then like it's affordable and it helps them out throughout. And then now from the obedience perspective also, there's also like this distinct link between like us also being God's also servants, like as we grow up and being in obedience to him, and we should have kind of like portray that servant mindset to like, okay, God is like above us in everything, in all aspects of life, and now we must follow him in that order because we trust him, but then we also have security within him in how we live our daily lives. So
Mhm.
that's also something that I've picked out. I don't know if it is the right way of thinking, if it has.
Well, you're touching on a lot of important things that are said, yeah?
I was just gonna say, like we're learning in our reasoning classes, to like with any argument, it's best to start off with what do we both agree on?
Yeah.
Like we agree that slavery that we understand, child slavery, and then define the terms, and it's like, well, where did this originate? Prince Henry or whatever, and the navigation and all of that, and then go back to the Old Testament
Mhm.
and everything that has just been said.
That's a really good point, is to clarify and emphasize the points of commonality, so that when you then do bring up nuances, people don't think you're trying to defend something that they find, entirely ethically objectionable. You can say, oh, no, I agree with you that certain things are problematic. Now let's go figure out how we reason about what the Bible says or doesn't say. Yeah, that's a really good. Okay, let's look at some passages. I skipped the one, but this is a selection of passages, not everything. So in Exodus 21 is the sort of the book of the covenant, where that starts just after the Ten Commandments. And the first thing it talks about is slaves. So it says, when you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th shall go free for nothing. Then a few verses later it says, when a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged, which means the person who killed him will be killed, or have the death penalty. But we'll get back to that in a second if someone picks capital punishment in the Old Testament. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. Interesting distinction there that's being made. I will point out that distinction is not made for non-slaves in the Old Testament system. Then a little bit later in the same chapter, so these are all in chapter 21 of Exodus, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. And presumably the same is true of any sort of bodily harm or anything like that. Okay. So we're going to come back to that in a second. I just want to go, so now one of the other sections that talks about slaves is Leviticus 25, as was pointed out. So here's some more nuance to that. So if your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve you as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner, which is a foreigner, basically. He shall serve with you until the year of the Jubilee, which is something that happened every 50 years, where a bunch of things were set free. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. This is talking about fellow Israelites. And then a few verses later, as for your male and female slaves whom you have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. So it does make this distinction, it seems, at least in Leviticus 25, between slaves that are the Israelites, who can't be slaves in a proper sense because they are already slaves of God, and you shall not make slaves of the people of God, and then slaves that you could perhaps buy in the normal slave economy of the ancient world. And then in those cases, when you have those slaves, the regulations from Exodus 21 would start to apply. So that's when he has certain protections for his body and other things like that. There are other verses in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy as well. It talks about how if a slave escapes their master from a foreign nation and comes to you, you shall not take him back to the nation. You shall keep him and house him and protect him. Things like that. Slaves are also to rest on the Sabbath like the rest of the nation, so they're included as part of the nation. They're not excluded as citizens within the nation. That's both foreign slaves and Hebrew slaves share in the Sabbath rest. And yeah, I think, and then they, as we pointed out from I think a few places, they are understood as part of the household. So they live with you and things like that. We're not thinking here, this isn't a particularly rich economy. We're thinking here about like farmers. So they have like people living with them on their farm as they make food and so on. But I think you can see from this that it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of what we would like to see and what we would not like to see, right? With our modern sensibilities, I think that's a fair thing to say. It's not clear cut like you shall not have slaves or anything like what we see in say like what we would like to see in like say a modern human rights situation. It's sort of a mixed bag where slaves are separate, but distinguished from the people of Israel in terms of citizens. Sorry, they're not separate. They're included within the people of Israel. They are not treated with the full status of a citizen, but they are nevertheless protected in terms of their bodily integrity. They aren't excluded from festivals like the Sabbath and the Day of Atonement and things like that. So they participate in all of the religious and theological benefits of the people of Israel. But there is this distinction made between foreigners and non-foreigners, which could be overcome if you wanted. So if a foreigner became an Israelite, then all the Israelite laws would apply to them. So that's perfectly fine. Like Rahab, for instance, we see, she becomes an Israelite, gets treated like an Israelite, no worries there. But if they chose to stay foreign, then they would have this lesser existence.
Yeah, I think that's kind of, so my implication is, as far as we know, other civilizations, ethnic groups in the ancient Near East, Middle East, these rights didn't extend to slaves. As far as we know.
That used to be a common point, and it is true in some civilizations, but in other civilizations, actually, they have plenty of protections. So they don't have maybe the Sabbath protections and things like that, but in the law of Hammurabi, for instance, the slaves get to go free after 5 years.
Yeah.
They don't have to wait 6 years.
So I think the point is that by and large, like even if Israel were to buy slaves, Israelites would buy slaves.
Yeah.
The picture is that those slaves are coming into the broader covenant community.
That's right. Yeah.
And that Israel, in some sense, is fulfilling its like term like showcase community, like displaying and demonstrating to the world what a community living under covenant with God is
right.
like.
Yep.
So the trajectory of one could argue the trajectory of slavery, even foreign slaves, who could be inherited as property amongst Israelites. That's the trajectory is actually that wouldn't be the case going forward for generations.
Yeah.
That they would choose.
They wouldn't have opportunities to become part of.
They would choose to become part of this covenant.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's the kind of trajectory of it.
So when it comes to thinking about this, I do think we don't want to paint too rosy a picture, right? So we're not saying that they're exactly the same, but we do also don't want to say, oh, well, they're completely mistreated and it's slavery en masse and all that kind of stuff, because that's just not how it was and how it is and how it has been for the vast majority of human history. I think a tendency with Christians is that we read a verse like this in Deuteronomy 4, where it says, "And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as the law that I set before you today?" And we put a burden on ourselves to try and prove that this law given to Israel must be perfect in every possible way that we would measure today in our current circumstances. That's just unfair, and that's not really what that passage is talking about. It's talking about how this law makes it possible for God to live among his people. Right? So by following this law, God, the creator of the universe, is going to be accessible at the temple, right? Which is what the verse exactly prior to this says. And so we shouldn't be too disappointed, I guess, that certain circumstances within the original ancient context would have prevented God, I guess, from realizing the exact perfect world that we will one day have in heaven. And I think this brings me to the points I want to make about slavery in general. So I would say, generally speaking, Old Testament theology undermines the notion of slavery, and we kind of saw that already in this idea that because you're slaves of God, you can't have each other as slaves. Right? That's already something that is beginning to cut at what is commonly thought about slaves, where if I'm hiring someone to do work for me, they are lesser than me. And it's like, well, no, actually, in God's eyes, you are both just slaves of God. Okay? The other aspect, other doctrine of the Old Testament that's pretty prevalent here is the image of God, the idea that all of humanity is in the image of God, not just the kings or the aristocrats or some important people. That includes your slave, right? So in, say, apartheid or a lot of slavery contexts that we are more familiar with, slaves are treated as lesser humans. They maybe weren't even humans. Their rationality was questioned, their need for education and all those sorts of things were questioned, which is what justified, at least in the minds of people, a lot of mistreatment. And that's just not the case in Old Testament theology. You can't look at a slave, regardless of whether they come from a foreign nation or your own nation, and say they're not made in the image of God, because that's just not what the Bible teaches. Never taught, from Genesis 1, verse 1, chapter 1, right? And then this idea that we've already mentioned that they had protections, they shared in the Sabbath and that kind of thing, so they weren't excluded from the normal experience of life. This idea of us being slaves of God is actually something that gets carried through into the New Testament, but now gets expanded beyond the nation of Israel. So just as the people of God can go beyond the nation of Israel, so too does the logic of Leviticus 25. Now, there's no sense in which it's like we don't really talk much about, and you don't really see much in the New Testament about a Christian having a non-Christian slave. He talks to people who are Christian masters, and he says, you are a slave of God or servant of God. And he says to slaves, you are also a servant of God, so respect one another, right? So we see Paul working this out in, say, in the book of Philemon, where he's taking that idea from the Old Testament and applying it to this much broader inclusion into God's people that has been made possible through Jesus, which with it brings a further undermining. It like further realizes the undermining of the principles or hatred underlying slavery that the Old Testament had started. I think the second point here is a really important one for us to realize, and it's a point made very forcefully by Calvin in his thinking about the law. You should think about the law a lot of the time in terms, like similar to how the divorce laws worked, right? So when God said, you shouldn't divorce, right? Don't divorce. Marriage is, a union in front of God. But like, if you have to divorce, don't mistreat the parties. Don't mistreat the woman. Make sure the woman is protected and all these sorts of things. Because in the ancient context, divorce could have led to very large mistreatment of women, particularly in that society. And so he puts a bunch of laws in place to protect women in the context where divorce occurs. The Pharisees in Jesus' time took that to be, God is condoning divorce, which is what Jesus says, no, that's not true. That law was given to you because of the hardness of your heart, because you tend to sin in these cases, you tend to go excessive with your cruelty, and he put those restrictions in place to stop that cruelty from being in excess. And the same is sort of true what we have here in the Old Testament laws about slavery. God is not condoning slavery, and he is not saying that he's not also outlawing slavery outright. He's just putting restrictions in place to prevent the excesses of cruelty of slavery that occur as he draws people from a context where slavery is just the norm into a life that he kind of wants them to live. Okay? So that general principle is very important to bear in mind. And I think that you can only accept that once you accept that the law doesn't have to be perfect in everything it says. Right? It is perfect in the sense that it's drawing people to a life with God, but it's also limited by the circumstances in which those people found themselves and the limitations that they have in their time. And so God has to kind of accommodate to them when necessary. And this brings us to the last point. I think we have a very warped idea of how slavery got destroyed, or in fact, we might think that slavery is not a thing anymore, but there's more people who are slaves today than ever before. We just don't see them all the time. Yeah, that might surprise you. There are a lot of slaves today. But even slavery itself was just a necessary, and this sounds callous, but I mean, it's just the truth. Slavery itself was a necessary economic function for the vast majority of human history. That's not to say that it was good or healthy, but the end of slavery came through very complex things like war and conquest. Ironically, colonialism is part of the reason why slavery stopped happening, because the colonies needed, or the empires needed the colonies to have workers that knew how to work the ground in the new places they were getting. So they offered freedom to slaves if they would go to these dangerous places to own and make food for the empire there, which is quite a strange and paradoxical result. But if you look at the history of slavery and what it actually took to finally get rid of it in the West, it was a very long and grueling time, and for the most part of human history, life without slavery doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't. I don't know what to tell you. So to say like, oh, why didn't God just like snap his fingers and say to stop slavery? It's like firstly, it still hasn't gone away. So our modern economy doesn't exist without slavery. So it's possible that it's not even possible to exist without some form of slavery in this world. I don't know. But it's a lot more complicated than we take it for granted because we don't own slaves. We think, oh, why doesn't God just get rid of slaves? Like, no, I don't think you quite understand the life on the ground in the ancient world, not even the ancient world, in the world like 200, 300 years ago. Like that was quite a different thing. And I should point out finally that today I think one of the things that makes slavery so difficult, and this is one of the things where we want to distinguish it, besides scale and treatment, one of the things that made slavery quite unique in the transatlantic slave trade is that it was race-based, which in this case it wasn't. So this would be Semites having other Semites as slaves. This would be like a Cape Townian having his neighbor as a slave kind of situation. That's what we're thinking about. Or Africans having Africans as slaves. A lot of people don't think about that, but that was also a big part of the slavery, huge part of slavery. And so that's sort of where we want it. So unfortunately, we don't have a nice, neat answer here, but I think there's an important lesson to take away from here, which is, and this is something you would need to encourage when you're talking to someone, is that the Bible doesn't necessarily condone everything that it permits, or that it restricts, or even that it depicts. Right? So people often think like, oh, because the Bible has all these stories about these sinful people, that it somehow thinks that that's okay. But obviously that's not. Like if you've read the Bible, you know that the Bible is quite judgmental about the people in the Bible, even the people that it holds up as the fathers of our faith, or great examples of kings and everyone, right? And so just like that with the law, it has the same fundamental tension in it, that God is dealing with sinful people, and sometimes that just means accommodating to where they are and restricting the excesses of sinful cruelty. All right. So that is slavery. What would you like to talk about next? The next slide is capital punishment. Do we want to talk about that? Okay. So this is the objection. How could God sentence people to death for things like heresy, adultery, homosexuality, working on the Sabbath, or defying their parents? That's just a list of few things in the Old Testament that say, if you do this, they shall die, or we shall stone them to death, or something like that. What are people's thoughts?
Could an objection be that the price wasn't yet paid, so Jesus atoned for the sin?
Say again?
That Jesus atoned for our sin
Yes.
was not yet paid. So
Okay.
yeah, due to Jesus not yet dying on the cross, the law had to be applied.
But that's true of all sins, right? But not all sins get the death penalty. Why couldn't God just like not give the death penalty to anything?
Okay.
And like maybe say pay some money, or I don't know, walk 1,000 miles. I don't know what the what the punishment could be, right? But like something other than kill the guy.
Could it be that, like I'm looking at the list here, because this is in a theocratic society,
Yep.
where the government of the society is regulated through its cultic worship.
Yes.
This list of things, like I look at the list and go, oh, that's commandment 1, that's commandment 2, that's commandment 4, that's 5. Like there could be a link to a lot of these things, or behaviors or outworkings of defining very specific things of the Ten Commandments,
Right.
which actually relate back to the worship of God.
I think there's
I don't know.
there's certainly something in that where like today we tend to underplay sin if it kind of fits with what our culture is pretty comfortable with, and so we don't really understand the severity of sin, especially in this context, as you say, where it's theocratic, where like God is like right there, like what are you doing, dude? So there's definitely something to that. Yeah, that's a good. Samuel, were you gonna say that? No. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, let me tell you something interesting about the ancient customs that you might not be familiar with. It is, we notice by looking at other cultures around the same time that sentences like this weren't necessarily always carried out. The sentences weren't necessarily a prescription of exactly what should be done, but about quantifying the severity of a particular crime. So it would be something like, if you get the death penalty, then the claimant could ask for a lot more from you. It would be similar to what we do today, where we say like you owe this person like 10 million rand or something like that, as opposed to they can't claim 10 million rand. They can only claim like 10,000 rand. That would be like a lesser penalty. And so what you would do is this is called the idea of ransoming. So you would be given. So Lilia would sin against me. She would sin against me in some way that requires the death penalty. Teach me heresy, maybe. I don't know. She's like, yeah. Yeah. And then I would be able to claim from her when the fact that it's the death penalty means that I can claim for her like the maximum amount that the law allows me, whatever that be. And she could then either accept the death penalty if she wanted, or she could pay the ransom, where she would ransom herself away from the death penalty. But that ransom would be much higher for the death penalty than another penalty. And so we see this more or less explicitly in texts from other nations around, but we also do see mention of it in the Old Testament itself. So let me give you 2 examples. In Exodus 21, that chapter that we keep going back to, it says, when an ox gores a man or woman to death, and if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall be put to death. And then it notes, if a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him. So there, that idea that whatever is imposed on him, that like you can charge whatever you want, is a result of him, the penalty for this being the death penalty. Right? If it were a lesser penalty, then you couldn't charge whatever you want. It would be something lesser within whatever the laws of the thing are. Now, there is one exception to a case where you can't ransom yourself, which comes in Numbers, and it's for murder. So if anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses, but no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Moreover, you shall accept no ransom for the life of the murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall be put to death. So he is trying to emphasize this like exception to this. Well, we're not doing that. I really mean kill the guy because he murdered someone. Right? So there we still have death penalty. We do still have the death penalty in the Old Testament. And maybe we could raise questions about that, but I will note that penitentiaries and prisons, they are a huge sap on the country's economy. And even today, we still have, in all of the mercy of our legal system, you could say, we still have capital punishment for egregious crimes, and that's certainly what's happening here. I mean, the requirement for 3 witnesses or more than one witness is to prevent cases where someone just hates someone and they make up a lie about them. It's like it has to be an established fact beyond a reasonable doubt that they actually, in fact, did murder someone, not by accident, but like intentionally. So I would highly recommend in this context, when someone raises an objection, it's like, yeah, look, it's to acknowledge that it does happen, but it's good to try and look into maybe the original context in which this is given is quite different to my modern context. And sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's not, right? But in this case, it's quite a helpful thing to realize that actually the intuition of the law or the morality of the law is pretty similar to the way it works today. Maybe they don't use the same phraseology we'd use today, but the basic idea is there that if someone does something egregious, then you can require quite a lot of them. And then their life is the greatest thing you can require of them. So, I mean, we sometimes have the equivalent of this where we don't necessarily murder a person or require some exorbitant amount of money from them, but we just put them in prison for life. Right? That would be a similar thing. That wasn't really an option in the ancient world because prisons didn't really exist as a concept. But it captures the same idea, right? Life in prison. There's this, like you just lose all freedoms and rights as a citizen, and you're just constrained to live under pretty harsh conditions if you're in South Africa anyway. Yeah. Alrighty.
Maybe we can
Yes.
talk it for later, but it also there was a place in the Old Testament where they were building towns. They had the towns where the people who had committed murder
Yes.
could go. I mean,
They had, I think, you're entirely right. They have these towns. I forget what they're called now.
Cities of refuge.
Thank you. Yeah, so there is a thing like that where, but that's, as far as I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong here because I did not look that up for this talk. As far as I know, that's for people who accidentally kill someone. Then they can avoid the vengeance of the family by fleeing to cities of refuge where they will be protected. Yeah, but it's interesting that's like a middle ground between life in prison and the death penalty, right?
It's isolation from
It's-
society.
exactly.
Kind of a prison.
You don't really get as much of a choice now about where you can go and where your opportunities are and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, they're very similar. That's a very good point though. Yeah.
Is there any argument against that from the New Testament? That
Against?
Capital punishment that someone would use?
No, not as far as I'm aware. No. So when you read things like, again, capital punishment was the norm for the vast majority of human history. A world where capital punishment doesn't happen is a relatively modern invention, and there's been a decrease in capital punishment, but an increase in complaints about the prison system. So make that of what you will. Make of that what you will. When Paul is talking about how the government can exercise the sword on God's authority, that would have included capital punishment, because that was the norm in the Roman world that he's talking about. But there's no explicit discussion of it one way or the other in the New Testament.
And then you also have Christ with the woman being stoned, caught in adultery.
Yes, that is true. So I'm not sure exactly how far to take what that is, but definitely they were, in the context of this practice, they were way too quick to stone her. Like they should have, even if they found her guilty and things like that, they firstly should have brought witnesses forward, and they should have given her essentially due process, right? Where they would have given her options to ransom her life in various ways. Whereas it seems in that context, their religious zeal was just like taking them over in a sort of mob mentality kind of behavior. And it's like, guys, think about what you're doing here. How many of you disrespected your parents? Should we be stoning you? That kind of thing. Yeah.
Permissible, not command.
Say again, sorry?
It's permissible, not command.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, just on the other hand,
Yep.
mixing the slavery with adultery, and Solomon had over 800 concubines.
Yep. Yep.
It was like,
Solomon is a bad guy. I'll be honest with you, he does everything he can to be a bad king. It's like he took the checklist and went through the whole thing in terms of things that he shouldn't have done. Unfortunately, I guess in that context he was to some extent above the law, because he was the king, the one in charge of enforcing the law. But yeah, no, he's I think we can rightfully be like, dude, come on, when we get to see him in heaven one day, if I'm not going to make any judgments, but it's like, come on, man, what were you thinking? Yeah. All right. Next objection that we want to look at. Yep.
I don't really understand this one, so I'm gonna ask it. So atheism is a lack of belief.
Right. Okay. Let's go to that one. That's all the way at the bottom. The hardest part of this is remembering in what order the slides are. There we go. So this is when you're talking to an atheist, obviously. Well, maybe that's not obvious, but when you're talking to an atheist, they'll say, well, you need to give me evidence that Christianity is true. And they'll say, I don't need to give you evidence that atheism is true because atheism is true. Because atheism is not a belief. It's a lack of belief. I lack the belief in God, and therefore I don't have anything to prove. Right? So it's sort of a way of shifting the evidential burden in your opponent. Because normally when someone says, let's say if you're talking with a Muslim, right? If you're talking with a Muslim, you have to say, okay, I have to give reasons why Islam is false and or reasons why Christianity is true. And the Muslim has to give reasons why Christianity is false or reasons for believing that Islam is true, right? So there's a balance there. The atheist is trying to get out of this evidential burden by saying, well, I don't really have a position. I just lack a position. Does that make sense? Have you encountered this before? It's a pretty common move on the internet. Not really with philosophers, because philosophers are like, that's stupid. But it's pretty common on the internet, and it's worth thinking about how you would respond to it, because it's very likely that if you talk to an atheist who's encountered this, they'll use it, because it's quite a nice get-out-of-jail-free card kind of thing, right?
True atheism is also extremely rare.
What's that one?
True atheism is also extremely rare.
True, yeah, exactly, yeah. So how would we respond to this?
Well, they would have to prove stuff like that God doesn't exist.
What if they said, like, I can't prove a negative? You can't prove a negative. Or perhaps they would say, well, I don't believe God doesn't exist. I just don't believe that God does exist.
Yeah, that's not atheism, isn't it?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Let's actually go there. So I have this grid. I see that my font has relegated the E into the bracket, into the X there. Ignore that. Basically, what we want to ask ourselves is, okay, what is the spectrum of views that we're considering here, right? So we've got two statements. On the top, we have the statement God exists, yeah, and on the side we have the statement that God doesn't exist. And for each of these, you either believe it or don't believe it. Okay. So now you can ask of anyone. So this is why, for instance, the top left corner is not possible, because you can't both believe that God exists and believe that God doesn't exist. Maybe you can if you have convinced yourself that contradictions are possible, but we're going to just put those people into a little box by themselves where they can be crazy over there, right?
And believe those.
Yeah, we'll just be like, cool. In that case, Christianity is true and Christianity is not true. You should believe in Jesus. Let's go get baptized, right? Like you can do something like that if you want, right? But for the most part, we have theism in the bottom left, right? Theism being God, we believe that God exists and we don't believe that God doesn't exist. I'm doing the same wordplay that I did with positive and negative apologetics. I don't know if you noticed that. Atheism is typically or historically been the term for the position that says we don't believe that God exists and we believe that God doesn't exist. Right? And then you might say, okay, well, what's the other option here? And that's called agnosticism, where we neither believe God exists nor we believe that he doesn't exist. The reason that we can say we neither believe either is because we can say, I don't know. Right? So that's what the agnostic is saying, is that A is not, and gnosis is knowledge. I don't know one way or the other whether he exists, so I can't say I believe or disbelieve either. I still have to figure that out. Right? And so what the atheist is trying to do here is he's trying to emphasize atheism's top part, right? That he doesn't believe that God exists. But he hasn't yet sufficiently distinguished between whether he's an atheist or an agnostic. He's just saying, well, I don't believe that God exists. Well, that's true of agnostics. Okay, so so you can ask this person, well, what do you believe about the statement, God doesn't exist? Then he says, I don't believe that. Then he's not an atheist, he's an agnostic. He says, I do believe that. Then he's an atheist, and now he has something to defend. Right? At the end of the day, it doesn't actually matter what he calls himself. Maybe he'll call himself a soft atheist. Right? He'll introduce a distinction to make himself feel like he can own the label atheist, even though he's just an agnostic. You know, what people all throughout the world. But who cares? Right? The point is, what does he believe about these two statements, or not believe about these two statements? If he doesn't believe anything, then he doesn't have to show anything. We just have to help him think through the issues and all that kind of stuff. Great. If he does believe that God doesn't exist, well, now he has a better. Simple as that. What he calls himself, you can be like, yeah, you call yourself whatever you want to call yourself. All I care about is what you believe about these two statements. And then just take it from there. Don't get caught up. So the lesson here is, don't get caught up in defining terms the way that you want to or the way that they want to. Just focus on the underlying ideas, right? That these words are just meant as shorthand to convey a set of beliefs that people have or don't have. And so if they're using the words to like wiggle out of something, just focus on the beliefs themselves. It takes a bit longer, right? Because you have to spend now a conversation figuring out, okay, what do you actually believe? So it's a bit inconvenient, but it's also like kind of besides the point, what they call themselves. They can call themselves a Schlabasiist, and like, I don't care what that set of things is. Why do you care about these two propositions? Make sense? Okay. Alrighty. Back to the beginning. Every time I do this, the slides get longer because I fill in more of I think about how to write slides for more of them.
Just quickly, so let's say they
Yes.
are an atheist.
Yes.
Now they need to prove that God does not exist.
Yep.
Let's say they're a true atheist. What are quick objections for them to prove that God does not exist? Can we use like cool things in science, cool facts of a cell or mitochondria, like stuff like that, and how that cannot just be by coincidence? What would you say? Or
I would say listen to the second talk where we gave an argument for God's existence. I have the video that I can send you. In the second talk we gave an argument for God's existence and we gave an argument for the historical reliability of the resurrection. So those would be things that you would help to get someone, regardless of actually whether they're an atheist or an agnostic, to get someone along the journey towards believing in Christianity. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, hi. We got plenty of time. I mean, so we can go as long as you guys want to go. I'm just saying we can stop whenever we want to stop. I'm not saying we're not going to go on for 2 hours. Yeah. Okay, cool, great. Okay. Now let me just figure out where it is in the order of my... Okay, so it's in the morality section. Cool. There we go. Well, hang on. I got a slide that states the objection in length. So here's the objection. Christianity celebrates and legitimizes cosmic child abuse, namely the Father punishing the Son on the cross.
That's different than what I thought it was.
Okay, what did you think it was?
Well, yeah, like human trafficking and all of the...
Okay.
Yeah, everything that's... Yeah, parents abusing their
Yeah,
children.
discipline as well.
That's what I was thinking. But this makes sense now, the cosmic.
Okay, sorry. I apologize. I think this phrase comes from Richard Dawkins. I think he spoke about the cross being an instance of cosmic child abuse that makes Christianity like repellent to anyone who's sort of civilized. Do we still want to talk about this one, or would you rather talk about something else? Okay, cool. Did you have your hand up? You gotta stop stretching like this, man. Okay, so what would we... maybe let me give some context. So this targets specifically the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement. Have you heard of that before? Stephen likes saying that in the... Lilia's like, sorry, what now? Penal substitutionary atonement. The idea that Christ suffered in our place to take on our punishment that we would have deserved on the cross. So how would you think... What would your thoughts be about... if someone raises this, they're like, I can't be a Christian, like it legitimizes and celebrates this ridiculous instance of cosmic child abuse by God himself, who should be like the paradigm of moral goodness. You know, you're telling me he takes pleasure in his son's torture and death? The hell's wrong with you?
Well, okay, so I don't think, maybe I'm misunderstanding part of the Trinity here, but isn't Jesus God?
That is true. Although there is, so I'll play devil's advocate a little bit here. There is a distinction between the Son and the Father, right? And he says, like, my God, why have you forsaken me on the cross? So there is some distinction here, and it's in that distinction that we're situating this cosmic child abuse objection. But good initial thought. Like, we have to be clear exactly what's actually going on here. Yeah.
I think you can almost sidestep and by analogy share another story that we would celebrate as an expression of love and sacrifice that like cross the board. So I could think of a situation like stories from World War II where a captain sends a soldier in to rescue others.
Yeah.
And he gives his life and dies that others might live.
Right.
I mean, the movie Saving Private Ryan.
Sure.
Literally.
Yeah.
And it's like we look at that story and we celebrate that story.
You say it's heroic.
And no one thinks about the lieutenant and thinks he's an awful person. You know, they're like, look what he did. Look
right.
what he and so that Private Ryan might live and then go on to live a full life and have children and grandchildren. It's like so by analogy you almost could start with a story like that and go, that's what's actually happening. Like that's a closer picture.
Sure.
Versus what Dawkins is just spouting off his kind of explanatory rhetoric. Yeah. Yeah. So that would be one way I would kind of like share a different story by analogy and then kind of point to that's actually this isn't a child abuse, this is a willing participant who's taking that's a kind of handle it that way. But I think I would sidestep it first kind of create clarity and then go.
Create like an alternate picture rather than this like visceral emotional picture that's being framed as I think that's good. I think that's really good actually. So I'm going to get to that in a second. I want to say it's not the end of the world if you just say, okay, well maybe penal substitution is wrong. Okay, we're not denying the atonement. I mean, I believe penal substitution is correct. Don't get me wrong here. But like, how a second?
What is penal substitution?
This idea that it's a particular formulation of the atonement that has been around in church history since the beginning, but came to prominence, I guess you could say, in the Reformation. The idea that Christ took on the punishment due to us on the cross in our place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it.
But the church fathers considered lots of different models of the atonement. One of them was the Christus Victor model, or the ransom theory, where God has ransomed the earth back from Satan. Or the Christus Victor one is actually closer to the exact Saving Private Ryan. Like, it wouldn't just be an analogy, that would be like, that's kind of describing exactly what Jesus did. So there have been lots of models of the atonement that aren't the penal substitutionary model. And like, if this is the only blocker that someone has to Christianity, you'd be like, fine. Like, just believe another model. Like, who cares, right? And then you can always talk to them about it after they're coming to church and they've been able to see the benefits and all the positive framing of it in like sermons and so on, then by all means talk about it then. But like, if this is what's stopping someone, be like, bro, just throw it away. Like, just believe one of the other trillion models that exist and move on with your life. That said, I do think the penal substitution model is actually closer to what James is suggesting than what this person is thinking. So what this person is picturing is that God put Jesus on the cross against his will and then punished him out of anger that he did that. Whereas it is better to think of God as sending his son to save us, his son willingly going, and not necessarily even being punished in our place. So that's kind of a weird thing to think about. But John Stott, who's one of the big defenders of penal substitution, says, we must never make Christ the object of God's punishment. Which is kind of a weird thing to say, because it's like, didn't you just say he was punished in my place? Like, what do you mean? Right? It's a kind of a weird thing to be saying. So William Lane Craig, in his paper where he talks about this a bit, he's a recent defender of penal substitution. He's recently got a book out on it. He says this: on such an understanding, like John Stott's and others that common ideas of penal substitution talk about, he says, on such an understanding, God afflicted Christ with the suffering which, had it been inflicted upon us, would have been our just desert and hence would have been punishment. Right? In other words, Christ was not punished, but he endured the suffering which would have been punishment if it had been inflicted upon us. So he suffered, definitely, and he was given up to be destroyed by sinful human beings, but God wasn't punishing him because there wasn't anything to punish. He was innocent, right? If we had gone through that, it would have been just punishment because we aren't innocent, right? So Christ suffered, but wasn't punished. His suffering allowed our punishment to be removed from us, right? Does that make sense? Does that distinction kind of make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
He wasn't punished because he wasn't guilty.
Yeah, punishment involves inflicting suffering on someone because they are guilty, as like an outpouring of justice, right? But Christ's death was decidedly unjust, right? He was crucified for all the wrong reasons. There was false witness brought against him, a false testimony, brought against him. People. I mean, if you just read the Passion narratives, it's not an exemplar of justice that you would go and point someone to. It's the exact opposite of that, right? So he was killed by sinful men, and God gave him up to do that and allowed that to happen so that he could atone for our sins and therefore shift our punishment away from us. Well, not destroy it, basically. Essentially destroy the need for punishment in the first place. And so it's not right to say that God vindictively punished his own son out of wrath. It's that he lovingly let his son be taken by sinful men to have them do whatever they wanted, so that the needs of justice no longer need to be meted out on us in punishment. Make sense? Now you can go even further. You can say some believers or some proponents of penal substitution will say that he was in fact punished by God, and they will work that out in detail. But I like this version of penal substitution more. So that's the one I spoke about. So the lesson here is just to be very clear about like what is the doctrine actually, like how have defenders of the doctrine actually articulated the doctrine that someone is objecting to? Because sometimes it's more nuanced than what we think. I didn't know this until I thought about this question, and then I went and read more carefully the people who speak about penal substitution. I was like, oh, hang on a second, this isn't quite what I thought. So, yeah.
And it also answers different to someone not list objection versus scoffing. The way that's worded is more in terms of scoffing than objection.
Yeah, right, yeah. We had a question over there?
Yeah. No, I think also just the way you can maybe simplify is like going back to now, like looking at how the life of like in terms of like how he lived his life, how he worked with people, how he shared the gospel with people, and then like share, okay, does this look like someone that actually is deserving of punishment? But then also, I read now this book about baptism last year, like also how like the Holy Spirit, the Father and the Son are also like in like having a discussion about like what's going to happen now, predicting the future, but then decide, okay, how can we also provide a link for people to now come back to God,
Mm-hmm.
because now they failed God in the ways of like not following the rules and falling for paganism and secular things in the world, and decide, okay, and he has a conversation with the Holy Spirit and also the Son is like, okay, my son, we're gonna have to send you through, but from this your journey is just gonna be the link between now the people, you, and then me.
Okay, so there you're kind of reframing the picture again of like what exactly is going on here. Instead of this cruel and rhetorically perhaps powerful way, you're reframing it in a different way to help communicate something more accurate about the Bible. Yeah. Yes, Lillian.
Evolution, if we finished with this one.
Yeah, so are people okay to go until 1:15? Cool.
The evolutionary accounts of religious belief.
Alrighty, evolutionary accounts of religious belief. That is surprised no one said evolution and creation. Maybe everyone has their mind set up on that.
And if your evolution versus creation kind of leads onto it, depending on how.
It doesn't quite lead onto it, but we can talk about them both if you want. So here's, maybe you haven't heard about evolutionary accounts of religious belief before, but the basic idea is that evolutionary psychology is a branch of evolutionary thinking. Actually, I don't know. Is it a branch of psychology or is it a branch of biology? I'm not sure. It's some branch in some field, right? And they have postulated different ways in which religious belief could arise naturally from people within a naturalistic evolutionary process. So these guys are taking for granted that, or this premise is taking for granted that God doesn't exist, or if he does exist, he hasn't revealed himself. And so the question becomes, well, why would humans start believing in religion then? And they have given various explanations for why that would be the case in evolutionary terms. So maybe there's, for example, an evolutionary tendency for us to see, impose human ideas or faces or assume agency behind things even though they aren't there, right? So we tend to, because we are social creatures. And so then when we look out into creation, then we assume that there's some person behind all of this. Incorrectly or correctly, it doesn't really matter to these people. They're not really interested in whether God does exist or not, but more about how human beings might naturally come to believe that there is a powerful creator over everything, if they haven't perhaps directly interacted with him. So someone might raise this with us and say, okay, well, given that these accounts exist, there isn't one, there's a bunch of different accounts, but given that such accounts exist, it shows that belief can arise from this tendency, this natural tendency in humans to believe that there's agency behind things, and so we shouldn't really actually believe all this religious nonsense that you're talking about or presenting to me as Christian truth. So how would we respond to that?
That still doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. So I think you can evolve in terms of ethics and morality.
Yep.
But that's irrespective whether there was someone, being creating humans. So
Yep.
you could think for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't disprove that there is a higher power.
I think that's entirely right. So so this kind of line of argument almost presupposes that God doesn't exist in a weird way. But let's suppose we believe that God does exist and that evolution is true, and he used evolutionary processes, and part of what he did in using the evolutionary processes was instill this natural inclination to assume that there are agents behind things so that people would search after God. That seems like a pretty good act of providence, if you ask me. If the whole point about this world is to live with God in some way, then to instill this into the human nature itself is a pretty good thing to do. And so really this would be maybe an argument against the fact that it would be a response to an argument like this. Well, people are religious, therefore God must exist. Right? If someone said that, then someone could be like, well, no, can't really reason like that. But if we have other reasons to believe God exists, maybe personal experience, arguments for God's existence, or any other sort of the social value of religion, any other sort of reason, this would be irrelevant to that. This would just be like saying, okay, someone who believes in evolution can point to a natural mechanism by which humans might develop these beliefs. Does that make sense? So here, I think the key thing to look out for is circular objections. So this objection, if we are to make this an objection to Christianity or to God's existence, we have to kind of assume that God doesn't exist in the first place in giving this argument, which is sort of what was meant to be shown in the first place.